So here it is, we try and rescue kids, and when we fail to rescue them, we jail them. You can tell that their spirit is broken. That's their life. There's 2 points to be made here. Number one, apropos your question about who's in jail. If the same compassionate policeman had, instead of quitting the force, transferred to the drug squad, who do you think he'd be chasing in the streets? The same children he couldn't rescue. Because according to all the social evidence, epidemiological data, brain developmental information, they're the kids who are going to become addicts. Bio. It's a pleasure to be back in Burlington. I didn't know until last night that I was back because I'd forgotten that I'd been here before, which is not an infrequent lapse of mine, but it is a pleasure. Every day in the United States, about 130 people die of overdoses, which is to say that every month you have the equivalent of a 9/11 happening. And when you consider the attention, alarm, public effort, mobilization of resources, nationwide determination that were evoked by 9/11, you have to wonder, why isn't the tragedy that 10 times as great every year, why does that not elicit the same reaction, the same concern, the same sense of unity, the same determination to get at the bottom of it, the same desire to end it? Now that's of course only a small part of the addiction story, because many more people die of alcoholism and cigarette smoking, which are also addictions, which immediately raises an interesting question. Why is it that the far more lethal addictions are actually respectable, advertised on Super Bowl, say alcohol, whereas other substances that are no more dangerous and in the long term medically not as harmful, they're illegal? And why our jails are full of people who got addicted to the wrong substance? Now these are interesting questions, and the answers are not to be found in conjecture or prejudice. We have to really examine them. You can tell that their spirit is broken. That's their life. There's 2 points to be made here. Number one, apropos your question about who's in jail. If the same compassionate policeman had, instead of quitting the force, transferred to the drug squad, who do you think he'd be chasing in the streets? The same children he couldn't rescue. Because according to all the social evidence, epidemiological data, brain developmental information, they're the kids who are going to become addicts. So here it is, we try and rescue kids, and when we fail to rescue them, we jail them. This is the criminal justice system. The other point is about those dead eyes. Those dead eyes, what are they? They're another defense. These children can't feel their emotions. They mustn't feel their emotions. It's too overwhelming for them. So they shut down their feelings. What happens when you shut down your feelings? Life becomes boring, uninteresting, without pleasure. Now you're going to have to find that qualities outside of yourself. One way to do it is through addictions. Okay, there were other questions. Lots of other questions. Please.
Are the effects of childhood trauma reversible or only treatable? And in either case, how do we help all the children of conflict, be it Sudan or Iraq or Syria, that are going to be going through the same issues?
Well, the answer is that it is reversible, but it takes resources, effort, understanding, goodwill, and a lot of patience. And this society just doesn't have that. And you know what? Where's the who asked the question? Where are you? Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. But you know what? As much as I appreciate the humanitarian concern behind your question, never mind the kids in Iraq and Syria. Kids in your neighborhood. The kids in your cities. The kids throughout your nation and mine. All the kids who, because of the stress on the parents and the social pressures, are actually being distorted in their development. Now those kids that you describe, it depends very much on the context. If they have strong families that are able to stay together somehow and nurture these kids, there's a lot of resilience there. But the more unstable the families become, the less the parents are able to protect and nurture, soothe, listen to, and be responsive to the children, the greater the risk of trauma. It's going to be a huge problem, and we're already seeing it. Like, we can talk about these terrorists that perpetrate violence, even at the risk and sometimes the cost of their own lives, as being driven they're being driven by a crazy ideology. But actually, when you look at who they are individually, what drives them? What gives somebody that much rage and hatred? It's not a religion. It's personal experience and alienation and trauma. So it's predictable that we're going to see more of that stuff as those conflicts in the Middle East, which involve the whole world, of course, continue. Now, is it reversible? Yes, it is reversible. We know that from many, many examples, lots of studies. But again, it would take a lot of resources, a lot of patience, a lot of understanding. There was a psychologist called Marion Diamond, who at Berkeley in California in the 1980s studied rats. And they took rats at different ages, newborns, some of whom they deliberately brain damaged, adult, middle-aged, elderly rats, and they exposed these rats to different levels of environmental stimulation, better food, more playmates, toys to play with, and so on. They found after a couple of months that the rats at any age, including the brain-damaged rats, who had the better stimulation, they were smarter, they could get out of the maze more efficiently. But when they autopsied them, they also found that in the front part of the brain, they had larger nerve cells with more connection to other nerve cells and richer blood supply. In other words, that environmental stimulation actually caused a change in the state of the brain, even in the older rats. And that's called neuroplasticity, the capacity of the brain to develop new circuits. So the question, whether it comes to ADHD or other childhood disorders, and I could talk to you for a whole day just about these childhood disorders and how to understand them, but whether ADHD or childhood disorders or addiction or any other issue with adults as well, is if we recognize them not as ingrained, genetically determined diseases, but as problems of development, then the question becomes very different. Then the question becomes not just how do we treat the symptoms. And addiction itself is a symptom. Depression is a symptom. But how do we help these people develop out of those conditions? In other words, it's now not a medical question purely, but a developmental question. And development always requires the right environment. Now, if you're a gardener, you know that. If you're growing plants in your backyard, you know that if you want to encourage them to go into healthy, functioning beings, botanical beings, you want to provide them with the right nurturing, the right nutrition, minerals, water, sunlight, and so on. So the real question that's behind your question is, how do we provide the conditions for further development to people whose development was impaired with in the first place? Now, we know how to do that. We're just not doing it.
But are they really the problem? Or is the system built to turn them into one? It's such a powerful point. Development isn't just about treating symptoms. It's about the environment we create for growth. I mean, think about that gardening metaphor. You wouldn't blame a plant for not thriving if it's sitting in dry, rocky soil with no sunlight, right? But that's exactly what we do to people, especially kids. We expect them to grow, to flourish, even when they're planted in environments full of trauma, neglect, or chaos. And then, when they don't grow the way we want, we label them as problems or broken instead of looking at the soil they were placed in. The real challenge, and this is where it gets deep, is not just recognizing what went wrong, but asking how we can fix it. It's about creating spaces where healing and development are possible, even for those who didn't get the nurturing they needed in the beginning. And we know what's needed: support, safety, connection. But here's the frustrating part. We aren't doing it. As a society, we've got the knowledge, the tools. We could rebuild these environments for growth. But for whatever reason, we're not prioritizing that. So, what does that say about us? About our values? Are we too focused on quick fixes, on treating the symptoms of trauma, instead of digging deep and changing the soil, the environment, so true healing can happen? The solutions are there, just waiting for us to implement them. And it makes you wonder, are we willing to do the hard work that real healing demands? Or are we content to keep patching up wounds while ignoring the root cause?
Hi, thank you. You said you don't want to talk about politics. I'm going to see if I can get you to. Because of research I'm doing, I have the pleasure of talking to the author Carol Tavris. She's a social psychologist.
Okay.
She wrote the book Mistakes Were Made, But Not by Me.
Okay.
It's a book about cognitive dissonance.
About?
Cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
So she will submit that somebody whose worldview is committed to the disease model or the choice model of addiction could come to a training like yours. You could have the most sound science you want, but if their worldview is already engulfed with understanding the model of choice, they'll leave even more convinced that they're right. So given that the people in this room, I think, want to make change, how do people, when we go to our respective jobs, environments, break through the dissonance of people who would argue with the science model?
Yeah. There's a real problem in that the higher you go in the system and the more authority you have, the less likely you are to be open to this information. In fact, the less likely even to hear it. Any medical doctors in the room? One? That's about typical. Maybe 2, 3, that's great. I'm so glad to see some colleagues here. But I'll tell you something. When I speak to physicians, it's interesting what happens. I present them with the same information, but I do it more scientifically. I quote more from the journals because you got to prove stuff, right? I don't get a lot of arguments. I don't get any enthusiasm either. What I get is kind of a stunned silence. And that's for a whole lot of reasons. But one of them is that when people are invested in a certain point of view, and their positions and work depends on that point of view, they're not going to want to change that point of view very quickly. And the same with administrators and policymakers and so on. I mean, if this perspective was accepted, the implications would be tremendous. When I say tremendous, I mean they'd be huge. If this point of view was accepted, you'd have to change everything. You'd have to change how we provide prenatal care. We'd have to change how we practice birthing on this continent. In my province, in the United States, the caesarean section rate is something like 32%. In my province of British Columbia, it's 37, 38%. It should be about 7 to 8% at the most. And we can show that caesarean births interfere with natural hormones and bonding and so on. We'd have to, your country particularly, would have to change maternity leave policies. Women would be supported to stay home for a long time. If that's what they chose to do, they'd be supported in doing so. Legal policy would have to change. We couldn't be putting all these people in jail and punishing them for the fact that they're dealing with their suffering through substances that we arbitrarily decided should be illegal. The whole political discourse would have to change. I mean, you can see the implications. In institutions, people would have to think of long-term rather than short-term results. My short-term goal is to get you off this drug as soon as possible. And you know, I got 5 visits to do it. Well, the long-term goal is that you should become a functioning, self-respecting human being. That's going to take time. So you see that I could go on and on and on, but there's kind of there's an inertia in the system. Not because people don't mean well, or because they're not doing their best, just because, as you very aptly suggest, people don't change their perspective very easily. There's a very interesting study done on, I don't know if, I know that climate change is a Chinese hoax, according to but those of you that don't believe that it's a Chinese hoax will be interested in this one. A study looked at climate change deniers, people that just don't accept it. The more educated they were, the more vociferous was their opposition to believing that there's climate change. You think that education is the answer? No, it isn't. If you've got a mindset that's in denial of reality, then the more intellectual prowess you develop, the stronger your denial will be. And why do people deny things? That goes back to the fact that they suffered as kids, and the only way they survived was to deny their reality. Now they're still stuck in denial. So bad things are not happening, folks. It's all good.
It really makes me think about how deep these changes need to go. It's not just about fixing one thing, but rethinking everything from the ground up. Like, just hearing that C-section rates are so high, way higher than they need to be, that's wild. But it's not even surprising when you think about how the system works. We've turned birthing into this medicalized process, rushing through it, making it more about convenience or efficiency than about what's natural or best for both the mom and baby. And the consequences? Well, they go beyond just the physical, right? It affects bonding, emotional connection, even the natural flow of hormones that are supposed to be there during birth. It's like we're interfering with something so primal, so foundational, and we don't even realize the ripple effects. And then, the bigger picture, like maternity leave policies. How is it that we still live in societies where supporting women to stay home and nurture their babies isn't a given? It's almost like we've lost sight of what really matters. We push new mothers back into the workforce so fast, not even thinking about the toll it takes on both them and their babies. If we really valued that early bonding time, we'd make sure women had the support they need to stay home as long as they want or need to. But that's the thing, isn't it? The system isn't set up to prioritize that. It's about productivity, about keeping things moving, and we're paying for it in ways we don't always see right away. What really sticks with me is how this all connects to bigger issues. It's not just about birth or maternity leave. It's about how we, as a society, deal with people suffering. Instead of helping, we're punishing. We throw people in jail, especially those dealing with addiction, instead of recognizing that these substances they're using are just a way to cope with their pain. We judge them, criminalize them, but we never stop to ask why they're suffering in the first place. It's like we're so focused on controlling the symptoms that we completely ignore the root causes. And until we shift that mindset, until we stop punishing people for trying to survive in a broken system, nothing's really going to change.
So I don't have a very encouraging answer for you. And as to how you go back and work with this, I don't know what to tell you. You know, you each have to find your own way. But take heart at least that sanity is on your side. Yeah, so just wherever the mic is.
Right here.
Yeah.
In your Hungry Ghost book, you were, I think, incredible in maintaining a biopsychosocial and I think a spiritual perspective.
So,
But let me ask this. The emotional depletion that people suffer from their development, and then the self-medication to soothe it, in my mind, it's an individualistic spiritual depletion.
Okay, and what do you mean by spiritual?
What do you have to
What do you mean? Fair enough. What do you mean by spiritual?
That the essence of being is emotion. That what makes something important is emotion. Either it's bad, good, or neutral and boring, right? So if you are suffering and helpless to change it, you find how to self-medicate. That works, leads to more problems. But your emotions, like Winnicott would say, they're still empty. So to me, that means there's a spiritual depletion of the individual. And I know spiritual is a weird word because of all the definitions, but I'm just curious what you have to say about that.
Okay, well, look, so, I mean, I appreciate your perspective. I don't quite look at it exactly the way you do, but we might overlap on many things. First of all, the essence of being is not emotion. The essence of being is being. Emotions are responses of the nervous system to particular stimuli. That's not being. That's just nervous system responses. We have to have emotions. Without emotions, we don't live, and we're not fully ourselves. But it's not emotions that create being or define being. Number one. Number two, though, if spirituality to me means a deeper sense of yourself than your thoughts or your emotions, that there's something more essential about you than what you feel or what you think at any given moment. And that essential you is there regardless of what you think or feel. And the essence of trauma actually is a disconnection from that essential self. Become disconnected from ourselves in trauma. I can talk about that more later. The other aspect of spirituality for me is a sense of belonging. I mean, when you think about it, this is just obvious, trivial stuff. But not a single particle of any of us here, or this napkin, or this plate, or this thermos bottle, not a single particle is new. Everything that's in us, including the lungs that are breathing me and the vocal cords that I'm speaking through, every particle, every molecule, every atom of which is at least, every element, every bit of water, has been around forever. It just happens to be configured in this particular form for however many decades. But it's all part of a much bigger thing that's always been around and always will be around. So of course we're part of something much greater than we are. And this whole idea of division of me and you here and this nation versus that nation, it's an illusion on one level. So spirituality is also that sense of connection with something greater than yourself. Now people who are addicted, they lose that sense of connection. And that's where there's this spiritual depletion. Is where they start to think, as many of us do, that they're just, who they are is just their bodies and their thoughts and their emotions. But they don't perceive, how can they? When the world hurts you so badly, how can you imagine yourself as being part of the world? You see yourself as being an external, an outsider. And when people talk to you about God and all that, it just enrages you. Because what kind of a God would allow you to suffer like that? So this is where people lose out. So I agree with you, there's a spiritual depletion in addiction. Maybe I would formulate it a little bit differently than the way you would, that's all. Okay? But it also means that for a lot of people, spirituality of whatever form, and it may take religious forms or non-religious forms, but some kind of sense of belonging, connection to something greater than their little ego is an essential pathway back from addiction. That's the implication of where you and I would both agree. Okay.
This really hits home for me because it taps into something I've thought about a lot. Like the idea that addiction isn't just a physical or mental issue, it's a spiritual one too. When people are deep in their addiction, it's like they've lost touch with something bigger. They're disconnected from themselves, from the world around them, and maybe from a sense of purpose or meaning. And that's where it gets tough because it's not just about treating the symptoms, you know? It's about helping people reconnect to something deeper, whether that's a higher power, a sense of community, or just the idea that their life matters beyond the immediate pain they're trying to escape. And I think we forget that sometimes. We look at addiction and see the damage it causes, the broken relationships, the health problems, the crime, but we don't always see the person underneath, the one who's just trying to fill a void. That spiritual depletion they're talking about, it's real. It's like people are searching for something to believe in, something that gives them a reason to keep going. And when they can't find it in the usual places, family, work, religion, they turn to substances to fill that emptiness. But here's the thing. Recovery isn't just about quitting drugs or alcohol. It's about rebuilding that connection, finding that sense of belonging or purpose again. For some, it might come through religion. For others, through nature, art, or even just being part of a community. But whatever form it takes, it's essential. You can't heal from something as deep as addiction if you don't feel like you belong to something bigger than yourself. It's not enough to just stop using. You have to find something worth living for. And I think that's where we as a society could do a lot better, by helping people find that connection instead of just focusing on the surface level stuff.
Back here.
Marty.
Hi, thank you for coming today.
So where are you? Okay, thank you, yeah.
I'm a family doctor, and with all of the physicals that we do for kids or adults, there's just all these lists of things that we have to do now to measure certain things quantitatively, but there's really not a sort of happiness factor. I've often thought about this when I'm talking with people. They can check all the boxes from a health standpoint, but they're not happy.
Yeah.
And also with kids, same thing. And I'm curious if there exists a screening tool. Obviously, there are changes that could help everybody. But if there exists a screening tool that would sort of better isolate some of those families and kids that are especially higher risk, whether it's trauma or death or suicide. But there is not really a tool, as far as I know, that we would do in a well child that exists that would pull people out that might be at higher risk for addiction.
Okay. Well, I'm not aware of any such screening tool, which does not mean that it doesn't exist. I'm just not aware of it. It's a really good question. It'd be a helpful implement to have. However, you can certainly do an ACE score on a kid, an ACE score. That'll tell you a lot about the risk they're at. And you can download your own ACE score. You can actually go online tonight and just download the ACE score. And you can fill it out with everybody you work with. You can fill it out on yourself. It takes 10 minutes. It'll tell you a lot. Secondly, I can tell you for sure that any child that's acting out is expressing unhappiness. And if you look at this phrase acting out itself, I mean, again, I'd love to talk to you for a whole day just about kids, but if you look at the phrase acting out, when I say acting out, what are you hearing? What do you hear when I say acting out?
Doing things causing destructive.
Destructive, causing trouble.
Whatever.
Right. That's not what it means. Okay? The phrase is very specific. It's a good English phrase. We act out when we don't have the words for something. So in a game of charades where you're not allowed to speak, what do you have to do? You have to act out. If you landed in a country where nobody spoke your language and you had to show that you were hungry, you'd have to act out. So and what are kids acting out? They're acting out their deepest emotional pain and their needs. So when a kid is acting out, they're actually communicating. It's our job to interpret what is it that they're acting out, because they don't know. If they knew, they would tell you. They're acting out their fear, their loneliness, their sense of inferiority, their shame, their rage at not having their needs met, their disconnect from nurturing adults. These are what they're acting out. What we do is the same thing as we do with adults. When a kid acts out, we punish them for it. We try and change the behavior instead of understanding what underlies the behavior. Now, those that are interested in childhood issues, two of my books address that. One is the one on ADHD, and the other is called Hold On to Your Kids. And you've got to learn a lot about what kids are acting out these days. Okay, we have 5 more minutes before the break.
First of all, happy birthday.
Happy birthday?
Didn't you say your birthday was this month?
Birth month.
Right.
I've had my birthday, but thank you. You're 2 weeks late.
In going along with the theme of not a lot of people understanding what the ACE test is and so on and so forth, I was also curious to take one step further, and I'm wondering if you could speak for a minute about this concept of intergenerational trauma.
Intergenerational trauma. Well, sure. Well, here's the thing about trauma. There's a man called Mark Woolen who's written a book. He's a family constellation therapist. He's written a book, It Did Not Begin With You. And he's just stating a truism, that trauma is intergenerational. I've already mentioned it really. When I talked about my own trauma as an infant, then I talked about how I parented. I was now passing it on to my kids. When I was a workaholic, even if I didn't yell at them, which I did, imagine yelling at a 2-year-old. It's hard to believe now, but I did. But just the fact that I was a workaholic, which means the message I got was that other people are more important to me than you are. Other activities are more important. What message did I give them? That they weren't that important. It's that simple. So we pass on the trauma inevitably. So even parents who abuse their kids, it didn't begin with them. In fact, probably they love their kids. They're just behaving in ways that are acting out their own dynamics, which stems to their own childhoods, which understanding ought to remove any sense of blame from the conversation. There's no blame here. We're just pointing out how things are. Everybody actually does their best, Everybody's always doing their best. That just happened to be their best. But what their best is, I know that my wife and I, our best was constrained by the trauma that we both experienced as kids. And those parents that are fortunate enough to work it out before they have kids or while the kids are young, well, they won't pass it on so much. And those of us that didn't figure this out till later, we do pass it on. And it's also intergenerational in the physiological sense. I'm not going to go much into this, but the whole idea of epigenetics, which means that genes are turned on and off by the environment, so that, for example, the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors will still have elevated stress hormone levels because of certain biological changes that are not genetic, but they're passed on from one generation to the next. So both psychologically and biologically, trauma is passed on. This is why, but unless we intervene, unless we actually get it, unless we stop it, and maybe this is the last comment before the break, one therapist once said to me that if your parents gave you this much crap, and you give your kids only this much, you're doing a good job. I'll see you in 15 minutes, okay? Abilities. So the person who's asking the question believes that somebody on methadone or Suboxone is prevented from going deeper. I don't agree. I think when somebody, first of all, There are some people that are on opioid that you can detox pretty quickly. There are some people that you have to maintain for a long time on methadone or Suboxone, which is certainly a step forward from having to shoot heroin in the back alley.
You know, when I heard that line about how if your parents gave you this much crap and you give your kids only this much, you're doing a good job, it really made me think. Like, that's such a raw but honest truth, isn't it? None of us are going to be perfect parents. We carry the baggage we grew up with, and sure, we might pass some of that on. But if we can reduce it, even just a little, if we can lessen the load for the next generation, that's something. That's progress. And I think it's important to recognize that even though we can't completely escape the patterns we inherited, we can still break them down, bit by bit. It's kind of a relief in a way, too. Knowing that being a good parent doesn't mean being perfect. It means being better, just a little better than what you had. And sometimes that's all we can aim for. But that's enough, you know? It's enough because it's progress, even if it's small. You're shifting the narrative, creating a little more space for your kids to grow up with less of that weight, less of that emotional crap that might have held you down. And then when we talk about addiction and recovery, it's a similar idea. We tend to think that someone needs to be completely free of addiction to be healed. But sometimes just moving from something dangerous, like shooting heroin, to something more stable, like methadone or Suboxone, is a step forward. It's not perfect, but it's progress. And progress, no matter how small, is worth celebrating. Because really, it's about harm reduction. Less harm today than yesterday. Less harm for your kids than you had growing up. It's a cycle, but one we can shift, even if it's slow. That's the thing that sticks with me. You don't have to fix everything all at once. It's okay to take those small steps. They still count.
But I've never found that somebody on opioid replacement therapy is incapable of doing deep personal work. In fact, I see it as a real opportunity. The methadone visit or the Suboxone visit should not be just about urine tests, which I think are 100% useless. Because I'm not going to take somebody off. If somebody's on Suboxone or methadone, and they find it heroin or cocaine in the urine, I'm not going to take them off their why would I? It's like saying that if you've got diabetes and you're on insulin, and you find sugar in a sugar cube in your pocket, I'm going to cut you off your insulin. What sense are we making? In any case, I think those opioid replacement visits are great opportunities to engage the person. Now that you're not having to seek, now that you're not having to jones around town looking for your next hit, how about we talk about what's going on for you? What started it all and how you're handling it? So I don't see it as a contradiction, personally. There was another question about digital technology, which is highly addictive. Highly, highly addictive. It's addictive for a number of reasons. What drives it? What drives it is a sense of aloneness and loneliness and emptiness. You know, the automatic tendency to go online, to stay online. But there's something else. So I co-wrote a book called Hold On to Your Kids. This is about children, young people. The greatest need of young people, and this is pertinent to addiction as well. As I said, the most important dynamic in human life is attachment, which is the relationship with the caregiver or somebody that you're looking after. So children are wired for attachment. Children are absolutely wired for attachment. Their brains are wired for it. They can't help it. And the more immature you are, the more you need attachments. By definition. But there's nothing in the human brain that tells you who to attach to. There's no circuit in the brain that says you got to attach to mom and dad. You're attached to mom and dad because that's who you see. You're attached to whoever's around. The duckling will attach to the mother duck, imprint on the mother duck, but if the mother duck is not there when he hatches, he'll attach to a dog or a horse or a mechanical toy. because the brain is wired to attach, but nothing in the brain says, here's the person you got to attach to. For the simple reason that attachments have to be transferable, because mom and dad may disappear or die. And if you only attach to them, you die. So attachments have to be transferable. It's in the nature of attachment of the immature brain, though, that it can't handle. Like if you're mature enough, you can handle not being with somebody or not being in a relationship with somebody. To the extent that you can't handle that shows your immaturity, the lack of maturity, the lack of maturation of yourself as an independent person. Young children, infants, adolescents, no such capacity. They're not meant to have that capacity. Because we have this drive to attach, we'll attach to whatever's around, whoever's around. Now in our society, from an early age on, the adults are no longer around. Now here's a fact about human beings. Human evolution has been going on for something like 6 million years. If evolution began over there at that wall, and we get to our present time at that wall over there, then until this far away, 2 inches away from that wall, we were parented and grew up in small band hunter-gatherer groupings, where children were always around the adults, and not just their parents, but all kinds of adults. So that children had multiple adult attachments. That's how human beings were meant to be parented. This is how we evolved. So even a nuclear family is an aberration. But wherever children were, they were always around the adults. And again, the adults were multiple: grandparents, uncles, aunts, neighbors. I read a book about pygmies last summer. And pygmies are interesting because they're the largest group until about a few decades ago, and their habitat and therefore their ways of life and culture is rapidly being expunged and destroyed. But until recently, they were the largest group that survived in the same state that they lived in 10,000, 15,000 years ago. So we could actually look at ourselves as we were until this long ago. I'll read you a paragraph from this book called The Forest People, which is about living with the pygmies. The flames from the fires flickered... Sorry, that's not it. The pygmies have learned from the animals around them to doze with their eyes open, and a sleepy midday camp can become filled in a minute with shouts and yells and tearful protestations as some baby, crawling around this warm, friendly world, crawls into a bed of hot ashes or over a column of army ants. In a moment, he'll be carried unceremoniously back to the safety of the hut. It does not matter which hut, because as far as the child is concerned, all adults are his parents or grandparents. They're all equally likely to slap him for doing wrong or fondle and feed him with delicacies. He knows his real mother and father, of course, and has a special affinity for them, and they for him. But from an early age, he learns that he's the child of them all, for they are all children of the forest. Now that's the natural state of human beings. Multiple adult attachments, absolute security. But because the immature brain can't handle what we call an attachment void, an absence of attachments, it has to fill it right away. Like the duckling will fill it with the toy or the horse, which developmentally is a disaster because the horse cannot lead that duckling up to adult duckhood. Now our children are the same. So when they're not with us at an early age, there's a void in their brains which they have to fill with whoever's around. And in our culture, who's around for most of our kids most of the time? It's other kids. So our kids now transfer their attachments from us to other children. And they become peer attached. And therefore they become peer oriented, which means that they get their orientation, their sense of direction, how to be, how to walk, how to talk, what's important, what isn't, what music to listen to, what to look like, from one another. And to get that validation from one another. Now, that leads to a desperate looking for attachments because children cannot give each other unconditional loving acceptance. They can't do it, not because they're mean or bad, but because they're not mature enough to do that.
It makes you wonder, if every child that ends up behind bars could have been saved with just a little more patience, a little more understanding, where would they be today? What if our failure to save them wasn't a reflection of who they are, but of how far we're willing to go for them? Wow, so right off the bat, you can feel the weight of what's being said here. They start talking about how a spirit can just break, you know? Like, imagine living in a world where it feels like your whole life is just a series of attempts to save you, and when those fail, you end up in jail. It's not too late, no matter how far someone's gone. The damage can be undone. The spirit, though battered, can be healed. But it's on us to provide that chance, to create the environment where they can rebuild. Because the truth is, broken things aren't meant to stay broken. They're meant to be mended, sometimes into something even stronger than before. So the real question becomes, how willing are we to step in and make that happen? So at the end of the day, it's all about progress, right? No one's expecting perfection, whether it's in healing from trauma, overcoming addiction, or even just trying to be a better parent. We don't have to carry the weight of fixing everything all at once. The real win comes from taking those small steps, those tiny shifts that make life a little easier for the next generation or even for ourselves. Because every step forward matters. And hey, if this conversation has sparked something in you, whether it's a new perspective or just a feeling of connection, you're in the right place. Inside Serene is your home for mental fitness, for deep conversations that matter. So if you're on this journey with us, don't forget to hit that like button, drop a comment to share your thoughts, and subscribe for more content that helps you heal, grow, and thrive. We're in this together, and every step counts. Stay strong, stay connected, and we'll see you in the next one.